Good afternoon, everybody. Jim McCauley here, Legislative Director, League of Oregon Cities. It's Friday, May 12th, and I think the countdown continues for us. We have a statutory deadline for the end of session that is June 25th and a targeted deadline of June 15th. So by the time Monday hits, we'll be inside of 30 days. I'll say in general this week, not much has changed. Just in terms of what's taking place in the legislature, fair amount of activity on the House side and in some of the Senate committees, but we have put a pause, or not we have, but the Senate has put a pause on having sessions to give leadership essentially more time to talk and see if there is a pathway forward. Yesterday we hit 9 consecutive days of a Republican walkout in the Senate. And they had one more basically to go within the margin before those senators who hit 10 consecutive could not run for office during the next election cycle. So that was a result of Measure 113, which was passed back in November of 22. I think the margin was 68 to 32, so pretty widespread support statewide. So we're hoping that some kind of solution can be advanced, and the leadership from both Republicans and Senate and Democrats within the Senate will accept it. So moving forward, as we get into the rest of this call, make sure that you keep your microphones muted unless you're specifically asked to unmute and ask a question. If you have not yet done so, please make sure you identify yourself by name and the city or organization you represent. That helps us with making selections for questions as we get going. Any instructions for that kind of a change is certainly identified and located in the chat. The webinar is a public space, open to all, and is being recorded. Questions from attendees will be held in the LOC lobby team, or be held until my lobby team has a chance to go through our entire update today. The webinar is going to end promptly at 1:30 unless we finish our business before then. And you can certainly follow all of our legislative activities from the website at www.orcities.org. For today's legislative webinar, we've got a few things to cover in terms of what's hot and what's going on. Ariel's going to be talking about housing bills and overall land supply legislation that's taking place. Lindsay is going to get into some of the enterprise zone and SIP gain share, or essentially all of that economic development incentive programs that exist in Oregon. Nolan is going to talk about a community navigator. Scott's going to have a conversation over DPSST funding. And then we're going to get into some kind of a check-in on some of our legislative success for to date. I know a lot of times that on these calls, it feels like a little bit of hair on fire in terms of what we need and some of that grassroots work. But I think we're at a good point right now where we can start sharing some of that success that we've at least been having to this point. So without covering any more introductory remarks, let's start with Ariel Nelson. She runs and heads our land use as well as housing and homelessness work. So Ariel, take it away.
Thanks, Jim, and hi, everyone. A couple updates today. The bulk of our focus on housing and land use has been on the governor's housing bill. That's House Bill 3414. We've been talking about it for a few weeks now, and an action alert went out this morning. And good news, we had an amazing showing from cities at the public hearing for the bill in the House Rules Committee this past Tuesday. We had a number of mayors testifying, city planning directors, some really great letters, testimony on the record, really strong messaging coming from cities about all of the positive hard work that cities are doing to encourage additional housing development, removing local barriers in your codes and your processes, examining your fees, and a strong message that the -6s, which is the current version of the governor's bill, don't work for cities and are going to have some really unintended impacts in terms of causing a lot of delay, uncertainty, and litigation for cities, which is going to delay development overall. We have proposed -5 amendments, thanks to the leadership of Representative Mark Gamba, former mayor of Milwaukee. We believe the -5s meet the intent of the bill, which is to provide some mandatory flexibility for developers for housing. But it does it in a way that's not going to cause all of this uncertainty and doesn't throw out all of the good regulations with the troublesome ones, right? And because the way the -6 works right now, it puts cities in this really impossible position of potentially not being able to deny variances for requirements that were passed by the legislature, middle housing, potentially elements of your housing production strategies, the climate-friendly and equitable communities rulemaking, wildfire mitigation requirements from Senate Bill 762. And there's also a number of things that the -6s don't allow cities to deny variances for that relate to federal and state environmental permits, DEQ permits. They potentially jeopardize or at least make very uncertain certification for floodplain insurance. So these are all things that you all know are really important and that we're being required to do under state and federal law. So the fact that the governor's office is unwilling to consider the impacts and kind of the confusion and difficult position this places on cities is troubling. So we are still pushing the -5s as the only optional alternative for this bill. We don't want to be opposing the governor's bill. We would like to give the governor a win on this. We want to partner with the governor. We share her housing production goals, but we have to do it in a way that can actually be implemented on the ground. So next steps, the action alert went out this morning, and the ask is simply, if you haven't already, or even if you have, please contact your state senator and representative and let them know the problems with the bill. The action alert has most of your talking points, but there's additional details linked. There's a one-pager that the LLC posted for the hearing, as well as a letter that the planning director from the city of Wilsonville wrote that has some additional details and really excellent points. She includes some specific examples of what this means for Wilsonville on the ground if the -6s move forward and why it's a problem. Great example if you're able to do that for your city. If you have a protected area or a specific update in your code or priority for your community that would be thrown out the door by the -6s, that this is Wilsonville's letter is kind of the template for how you might want to do that. And you can just do that in a call with your legislator, an email, whatever works. Please feel free to reach out to me with any questions. This is a really technical bill. If you aren't getting, if you hopefully you're working with your city planning experts. But if you need more context or you're just curious, any questions are welcome. Also, if you feel like you have a positive, conversation with your legislator, if you just want to shoot me a quick email, talk to so-and-so, that would be great. If you also think they need follow-up, if they could use some additional details and discussion, or they're asking really technical questions, I'm happy to do a follow-up meeting and outreach with them. So that's the update on 3414. Jim, did I miss anything?
No, you didn't, but I wanted to have a quick little follow-up on that. So part of, I think, what you had mentioned in your in the last few minutes and stuff is that our -5s or the -5s that you have worked on with the amendments will still create the same outcomes that the governor is after. Is that fair?
Yes, we believe that they will. If you get some comments, well, what about this and what about that with the -5? No legislation is perfect. That comes out pretty rushed from legislative council. We would love to have further conversation with the governor's office and the legislature about our approach in the -5s. If something needs to be tweaked there, we're very open to that. Right now, we're not being given that conversation. So I think that's another important message, is that we want to work with this. We want to make this work. We are not opposed to some required, flexibility in development standards, but they have to understand that they're throwing out standards that the state is directing us to do.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you very much for that. The other piece that you had was land supply legislation.
Sure. So it's been kind of connected to the previous bill, but the governor's made it really clear she wants them to be two separate conversations. There is currently a bill alive in the Senate Bill 1096, and then there's potentially going to be same concept could be moved into bills on the House side, but that's unclear at the moment. But essentially, the LOC has been working with the Home Builders Association and Oregon Property Owners Association on land supply, UGB, urban reserve expansion concept. It's an updated version of a bill that we opposed earlier in session, Senate Bill 1051. They came back to the table with cities and said, hey, what can we do to get your support on this bill? And did a lot of technical work and are continuing to do a lot of technical work on the bill to make it a much stronger partnership with cities and property owners or developers. It's truly an optional bill. There's no requirements in there, but if a city would like to expand their UGB or a property owner would like to, they can approach the city and the city can say no, and the developer can't bother them. But if they want to move forward and there's a piece of land that's adjacent to your existing UGB, or if it's in an urban reserve or in a non-resource land, so we're not talking about farmland or forest land, the city has the option to bring that in with some sideboards. You've got to be thinking about housing needs. You have to have housing needs to qualify. You have to be thinking about some kind of complete community things and making sure that you're not bringing housing in to the UGB that's going to be completely cut off from the rest of the community. There's some minimum affordability requirements. But that's essentially the bill. We are supportive, although our top priority remains ensuring that House Bill 3414 gets improved. And so we've been very clear with the home builders and development stakeholders that we need their help to make 3414 a better bill. And until it's improved, we don't have the bandwidth to support the land supply bill. So we really appreciate their partnership on that land supply bill. Some of you, I think, are endorsing that and signing on. A little unclear when it's going to have a hearing, depending on if they decide to move the Senate conversation forward or try and do that in the House. But if and when that starts to happen, we'll keep you updated, and you're certainly welcome to support or oppose individually. But we've heard that based on my conversations, the amendments and the updates they're making to the bill have largely resolved most cities' concerns. And so I only know of one city that's still opposed. But if you have thoughts, I'm definitely very happy to hear from you. I don't have a final version or most updated version of the bill just yet from the legislative process, but once we get that out of drafting, I'll be sharing that out. You're muted, Jim.
Thanks very much, Ariel. We'll hold questions again till the end of our presentation. So next up, Lindsay Tennis, who handles our taxation, economic development portfolio. This has been quite a challenge or a struggle throughout the session, trying to make sure that we can elevate extensions for enterprise zone and SIP and gain share, which have been historically incredibly valuable for economic development in the states. So Lindsay, I'll let you provide an update on where we're at.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Lindsay Tennis, your tax, finance, and economic development lobbyist. I think last week when we were on, we talked about a number of changes that have been proposed to update enterprise zones. Enterprise zones are up for their sunset extension. They expire in 2025, and that's both the standard agreement, which is 3 to 5 years of a property tax abatement, and the long-term rural program, which is between 7 to 15 years of a property tax abatement for new businesses that are moving into the enterprise zone or expanding in the enterprise zone. And so because they've been up for their sunset extensions, some legislators have been looking at policy changes. I think, a lot of this has been spurred by Oregonian articles that have talked about enterprise zone agreements in a few areas. There was a big Oregonian article yesterday about new deals in Morrow County. I think that have also shed some more potential scrutiny on these programs. So I think all session long, I think we've kind of been trying our best to get out the message that cities are using these programs responsibly and accountably to various degrees of success, depending on which legislator you're talking to. So the House Revenue Committee passed 2199 out of committee yesterday. And they moved this to the Joint Committee on Tax Expenditures with a due pass recommendation. We expect the Joint Committee on Tax Expenditures to hold another public hearing on that bill this week. And they did adopt an amendment with a number of policy changes in it. So the amendment that was adopted has a new transparency requirement that requires that the zone sponsor post the application from the company on their website for 30 days before the application can be finalized. So I think you all know this if you've handled enterprise zones, but once you designate the enterprise zone, companies submit their applications to the zone manager. And the zone manager has the authority to either accept or deny the application. So once the zone manager would like to go forward with accepting the application, then the zone sponsors would post the application on their website for 30 days before it is finalized. And often you can have multiple zone sponsors like a city, a county, a port, but usually one zone manager accepts or denies the application for that company to locate in the enterprise zone. And the intent for this is for the public to have an opportunity for input before that application is finalized. It doesn't specify what like the specific avenue would be for the public to comment on it, but just that if that information is available before the agreement is finalized, then the opportunity for the public to participate in that process would be present. I think and other proposals that have been proposed around more transparency had to do with requiring applications, more of the applications go through a resolution process. That was not ultimately what Chair Nathanson went with in this amendment, just this posting on the website requirement. Another new requirement for enterprise zones would be that the sponsors have to notify local jurisdictions if the enterprise zone agreements will impact other jurisdictions' infrastructure. I think this, this one is a little vague, and I think some communities are doing this anyway, but the idea is that, enterprise zone agreements are made, these companies come in and build, and then it might cause stress on a water district that is adjacent that didn't have the opportunity to participate in the decision-making process around that enterprise zone. So I think, again, the intent is to have local jurisdictions communicate with each other more often about these agreements. I think this is kind of one of those things where it's potentially a false narrative about enterprise zones and what actually happens in these agreements. But, some folks do this anyway. So, it might be a statutory change and might add some administrative burden, but materially, I think we're a little unclear on the impact that will have. But it is better than other proposals that have come before in other bills. I think the original intent here was to have Business Oregon be involved in determining whether or not enterprise zone agreements will impact other jurisdictions. And the chair agreed to take that piece out because we argue that that's just not what Business Oregon's role is in enterprise zone agreements, and they shouldn't be involved in evaluating infrastructure impacts, and that local jurisdictions have better knowledge to do that on their own. Another piece that got added in is exclusion of school district taxes for the period of extension in the standard agreement and any agreement beyond 5 years. So that would be years 6 to 15 of the long-term rural agreement. And so essentially what this means is in the program right now, companies for the years that they're getting the enterprise zone agreement have a full property tax abatement. So they pay no property tax. A big conversation that started kind of midway through session is the impact of these property tax abatement on schools and school revenue. And from the state perspective, I think legislators think that some of these enterprise zone agreements are giving up so much property tax revenue that the state has to backfill more of the state school fund with their general fund dollars. I think from where we're sitting, we see that in spaces where local governments are able to use these programs successfully, they build long-term property tax revenue and have to be backfilled less by the general fund and the state school fund because their property taxes in the long term are bringing in more. So I think there's just a fundamental like disagreement in how we see it and how the state sees it that has been really hard to get through. So if this were to take effect, essentially for years 4 and 5 of the standard agreement, instead of having a full abatement, the company would pay property tax on the portion that would go to school districts. And then in the long-term rule agreement, from years 6 to 15, the company would pay the portion of property tax that gets distributed to school districts. And I think right now LOC has been opposed to this amendment because we don't fully understand what that revenue impact would be and what that would mean in terms of reducing the value of the incentive. I think on average, 40% of property taxes are distributed to school districts. So the value of the incentive for extended agreements would be reduced by about 40%. Excuse me. So I think that we haven't seen numbers of what this would really mean, and knowing that that percent of property taxes that goes to school districts is different in every county. And so we would just need to have more of an understanding of how this would affect the incentive before moving forward. And finally, the bill has a 5-year sunset extension, so it would extend the programs to 2030. We have advocated for a 10-year sunset extension, which has been consistent with past extensions of the program. But there are other bills that have a 7-year extension, which I think would be better than 5, just for some certainty when cities are negotiating with companies. Sometimes those take a long time, and so just recognizing the length that some of these negotiations take and wanting some certainty around these programs. One thing the bill does not have right now is any specific exclusions that have to do with data centers or retail warehouses that had been proposed in other bills. And I think the retail warehouse piece was a piece that LOC could concede on, granted that it didn't affect warehouses that are part of other manufacturing operations. But if the language was targeted enough that it truly just touched retail warehouses like an Amazon distribution center, we were supportive of that because the original intent of enterprise zones was not to incentivize retail operations, but to incentivize manufacturing operations. So that would be consistent with the intent of the program. So House Bill 2199 with those policy changes has been passed to the Joint Committee on Tax Expenditures. We expect a public hearing to happen on that as early as Wednesday. So we will send out an action alert when that gets scheduled. But I think we would just really love city support during that public hearing. And I think what the committee really needs to hear is specific stories about how cities use these programs responsibly and really evaluate the impacts before going ahead with them. I am one lobbyist trying to tell legislators that local governments are using these programs responsibly. And I think they really, really need to hear it from you all and personal stories about the kind of companies that have used the enterprise zone agreements and the local benefits that have been received from that and the long-term benefits. Because I think sometimes, we kind of feel like we're just talking into the void about how local governments don't necessarily need more accountability with these programs, that we're doing it ourselves. So yeah, we will send out an action alert for that public hearing. I think at this point, we will probably be opposed to moving it forward and ask for an interim conversation But when we send out the action alert, we'll make sure to explain, sorry, exactly what our position is. And if you have any more feedback, please email me. If any of those pieces strike a chord. Sorry, I think I might be getting sick or something, but yeah, I think that's all I have to add on enterprise zones for now.
Okay. Thanks very much for that, Lindsay. Is it fair to say that there is still a wide gap in terms of legislators' knowledge of how these programs work, and that is part of what we're struggling with?
Yeah, definitely. I think there is definitely a misunderstanding of how the programs work. I think there's just kind of a broad view that you know, taxes are just, you know, it's a broad tax break without any discretion used. And so I think there's a big misunderstanding there that we have the opportunity to try to set that conversation straight.
Great, thank you. So SIP gain share, probably effectively in the same place, not looking real great in terms of latest amendments.
Yeah, so 3457 also got moved out to the Joint Committee on Tax Expenditures the same day with an amendment, the -5, and it had some pieces that we knew was going to happen, like raising the threshold for the amount of property that can be taxed. It also instituted a cap on gain share payments, and this is a sort of reimbursement of income tax revenue to local governments that sponsor the SIP agreements. This would cap those reimbursements at $5 million that go back to each county. As it stands now, this would only cut revenue for Washington County and the other taxing districts that Washington County distributes that revenue to. But I think what I've heard is, you know, the SIP is becoming more and more attractive to rural counties. And I think we want the potential for local governments to be reimbursed for revenue, especially when local property tax revenue is being abated for long-term income tax revenue. Gain share recognizes that and is a reimbursement mechanism to local governments. And so if we're capping it at a standard 5 million, it's not recognizing any sort of proportionality to the amount of money that is coming into the state from SIP agreements. Rather just setting it at a standard, and really disincentivizes any county from wanting to enter into these SIP agreements. If they're just giving up their property tax with a set number getting back that is not proportional to the investment that the county is making. And the bill also added essentially a 5-year sunset on SIP agreements. SIP has never had a sunset. The gain share program has, so that was a new policy change that was introduced this week. Yeah, so I think that bill will also have a public hearing in the Joint Committee on Tax Expenditures, and we can send out an action alert on that as well if you all would like to testify. I think, frankly, LSU has been a little less engaged in the SIP conversation than we have the enterprise zone conversation, because counties really make the SIP agreements, but cities often have a seat at the table and benefit from the economic development too. So if you'll have any feedback on those SIP and gain share changes, please let me know.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. You know, I said on the front end of this, that's been one of the biggest challenges, certainly frustration with this legislative process. And honestly, if we leave this session without having those extensions for what are arguably Oregon's largest economic drivers, as far as incentives go, it'd be incredibly disappointing to leave session having to carry these things over for another session to essentially relitigate or debate some of this conversation that we've been having for years on this. So thank you again. Nolan, you're next up on to bring us up to speed on a community navigator, Senate Bill 852.
Yes, thank you. So Senate Bill 852 is not one I've discussed yet with this group. The bill was introduced on behalf of the Oregon Department of Energy, and it aims to establish a community navigator program within the department. Something I personally believe that every state agency should have, but that's neither here nor there. Between Congress and the Oregon legislature, new energy programs and incentives have been created that will bring an unprecedented amount of investments for energy projects to Oregon communities. So, and as many of you are aware, most communities do lack the resources, time, capacity, or technical expertise to really research, understand, and apply for all the varying funds that are out there. So the goal of the Community Navigator program is to provide that information about potential funding resources, investments, and other technical assistance to communities that need it most. The aim is to help communities develop energy projects or to build energy-related capacity. The positions within the program will help communities navigate the complex funding opportunities that are available at both the state and the federal level. And the department also intends to have this person meet directly with cities and communities to understand their needs, help identify solutions and investments that are available to them. SB 852 is currently sitting in the Joint Committee on Ways and Means and is waiting for an official referral to one of the subcommittees. The expected fiscal is about $396,000 for the entire program. And while the funding was originally in the department's budget, the specific POP was pulled out just before the work session this week. So it's really now down to ensuring that the bill itself gets funded. So LOC is asking members to reach out to their legislators and encourage them to fully fund and support Senate Bill 852 and to pass it out of the Ways and Means Committee. We do have a one-pager that was created by the Oregon Department of Energy, and it's available as a resource and something that you all can provide to legislators. There's a link to that one-pager within today's bulletin. You can also email me, and I'd be happy to share the PDF directly with you. This bill will provide cities and communities with a very important resource to help navigate the complexity of state and federal programs that can really reduce the overall cost for potential energy projects if that's something that your city is interested in doing. It can be incredibly helpful to our community, so we're really making a strong push to ensure that this bill gets funded. I'll put my email in the chat here shortly, so please don't hesitate to reach out and ask. I do have an additional thing I'll mention, but I'll go ahead and pause there if there's anything else about this.
Nolan, I think that's good. Good summary. New item for us to take a look at, and hopefully will be a good bill should pass type of thing, as long as they can find the money.
Yes. Let's hope they can do that for this and a few other things.
Okay, fabulous. Go ahead and add your other item real quick.
So the other item I briefly wanted to mention is in this week's bulletin, I put a notice about some community planning sessions that the Oregon Broadband Office is putting on in advance of creating their final broadband plan to get access to the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Funds program from the federal government. They have to put this plan together, and part of that is reaching out to communities, understanding what their needs are, and then turning that around and incorporating it in with their final plan. So there is a link to the Broadband Office's website on today's bulletin. And I would encourage all of you to reach out to your communities, make sure community members are aware of this, businesses are aware of it, as well as yourselves, to attend these meetings. So you can really let the Broadband Office know what your situation is for your community, what the experiences you all are having, so that they are incorporating city's feedback within these final plans. So that information is in today's bulletin. The first meeting is actually coming up very quickly. It's on May 22nd in Tillamook. These are going to be throughout the state. but they're getting going on this really quickly, and they haven't given us a lot of time to get this information out, which is why I wanted to make a quick mention of this in this call today. So check out today's bulletin, it has that information. Reach out to me if you have any questions, but I would definitely encourage you all to go. There's also flyers that are attached to there for each region that you can share with your communities for folks that are interested in attending.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Nolan. So last of our items here before we get on to at least kind of a quick run through on some of our success to date is Scott Winkles, who handles everything related to general government and then some. So I believe DPSST is up for your conversation. Scott, go ahead.
Good afternoon. I think I've presented on this topic before on this call. It's related to the DPSST, the Department of Public Safety Standards and Training. It does a bunch of other things, but for the purposes of this conversation, we're talking about the police academy portion of their services. When I presented last time, we were talking about a 5-month backlog, training backlog, meaning that if you hired an officer today, if you hired a police officer today, it would be 5 months, and then enrolled them in the academy, it would be 5 months before they could actually enter the academy. That's adds a fairly long stretch of time between the hire date and when that officer is actually ready to work on their own. Usually it's about 18 months from date of hire. Today, the backlog is actually now at 6 months. And if the current service level at the academy is allowed to continue, that backlog goes to 20 months by the 24-25 biennium, the 25-26 biennium. So very much a concern. We are working with our public safety partners right now on ensuring that the plan that was developed by DPSST to bring that backlog down to a manageable level takes place. Essentially what they're doing is going to double the number of officers they train at the academy. It would require by hiring more staff. The lodging would be a concern. But because of the way we train police officers in the state, it's something that Oregon actually does really well. We can't just take that academy and put it somewhere else. There's training scenarios. There's the facilities are designed to create simulated urban environments or environments officers will see. It's not just classrooms, but also pursuit driving courses, firing ranges, they call the scenario village. All of these things just can't be immediately replicated. So we're asking for another $13 million for this agency, which is over doubles the current budget. The plan isn't quite finalized yet. We were hoping that it would. They've had some, I know the agency's had some conversations with the Ways and Means Public Safety sub. There's an interesting conversation because the questions from the committee are about training safety and making sure that we have that adding that many officers to the academy doesn't create additional risk. The way they've constructed the plan is there'll be essentially a day shift and a swing shift academy. So the same number of officers will be involved in the training scenarios. They want to keep the cohorts. There's usually 2 cohorts per class, down to 20. So they maintain that instructor to student ratio or the ratio in place. I think this is something we're going to have to activate the membership on. I want it to be on your radar because I know I know it's a concern. So I do want folks to know that we are working on this. And also be prepared for that legislative alert, because I think this comes to the point. I think we are going to have to light the legislature up with emails and phone calls and visits to get this one over the line. Interestingly, the money piece wasn't as big a deal to the committee as the safety piece. So we think the agency has an answer to that. And given the level of retirement, the number of people leaving the profession, this is something we actually really do need to tackle sooner rather than later. And that's what I got.
Fabulous. Thanks very much, Scott. What's the long-term outlook? Do they expect to have the same kind of shortage, even if they filled some of the funding gap on this? Is this something that's going to be sustained over the long term?
They have hiring, the agency did a survey and got hiring projections from most of the police agencies around the state. And they think if they temporarily increase that, double that capacity, they can get through the backlog. And after that, I think the situation becomes much more manageable. The part of what we're seeing is that there was training disruptions due to COVID. The classes just couldn't do some of the activities that are required in order to become a police officer in the state of Oregon. And we're the DPSST is something the state really needs to be proud of. This program is it's almost unique in the nation as to how we train police officers, and we get visitors from around the country regularly about how we do this. Hiring processes around the state or country are pretty disparate, but I think once we get through the backlog, the situation becomes better. I think at some point the agency is going to have to talk about expansion, but right now just the focus has got to be on clearing the existing backlog.
Fabulous. Thanks very much for the additional piece on this. So before we get into questions here, we're going to spend just a few minutes on at least giving you a sense for some of our success that's related to some of our priorities, but also some of the other legislation that we've been working on for the session. So I'm going to tee myself up first here. So House Bill 2095, this is the photo radar bill that effectively expands authority to all cities in Oregon up until this bill passed and is actually signed by the governor earlier this week. Your access to photo radar authority and fixed photo radar was only confined to 10 cities that were out there. So everybody will have that authority at this point in time going forward. A couple of other elements that were modified within the bill as well are going to help with some flexibility with speed changes on your local streets and things of that nature as well. So good outcome, and it's something that has taken literally the last almost four sessions to be able to find a window to move this thing through. So that's good news overall, and appreciate everybody's help on that. Next up, I want to bring Scott back on here to talk about House Bill 3111. That too is a win, and he's got probably a couple of thoughts to share.
Thanks. Yeah, so House Bill 3111, this was written at the request of the League of Oregon City, and it closes the loophole on that jeopardizes the release of employee and government official, volunteer official private information. We teed this up in 2021, and it was a very tumultuous conversation. I'm not sure why that was, other than it was taking place in the backdrop of the police reform bills. But this session it soared through. I think we lost 3 votes total out of 90 in the building in the legislature. The bill also trues up the privacy protections for the non-PERS pension plans. So PERS is, if you're a PERS retiree, your information is fairly well protected. If you were in a non-PERS retirement plan run by an agency, there are about, I think there might be a dozen of those within the membership. You didn't have the same protection, so we trued all that up. So big win. Bill's been signed. It does take effect on passage, and we'll be sending something out to the recorders to let them know if the new requirements, if they get requests for this private information that was previously releasable. So it was a good day for us.
Right. Scott, let's go ahead and stay in the queue, because I've also got another one teed up for you, and I've actually got it. It's actually a Senate bill. It's not a House bill, so it's Senate Bill 812. Is that right?
Senate Bill 812. I really like this bill. Our parks directors don't ask us for much, and so when they do, I assume it's pretty important to them. This is one allows cities to regulate the takeoff and landing of drones, also known as UAVs, in parks. The FAA really only allows state and local governments to regulate takeoff and landing anytime. As soon as the thing takes off, FAA considers it to be within their airspace. So does not have an emergency clause, so it'll take effect January 1. It's passed both chambers, waiting on the governor's signature, and she's going to sign it.
Okay, great. And you may as well stay in the queue because you have one other one related to public records. We probably should have hit that one as well, but that has a different outcome, which we're all going to be helped by.
Which bill was that, Jim?
Senate Bill 417.
Yeah, 417. Yeah, I don't think this was the public records bill that was brought by the Public Records Advisory Council. I'm not ready to call it yet. I think the bill's there's a lot of inertia against the bill. We've been in a work group all session on it with the journalists and the public records advocate and some others. But I think they're running out of calendar for this bill.
Okay.
It was introduced in a very concerning format, had a huge fiscal impact on us and the state. Whittled it down, but I just don't. I think it's going to be hard to get something out at this point in the session when you're short on calendar and senators. So
fair enough. All right, thanks, Scott. So 2 other items here to at least point to in terms of some success. Then House Bill 3201. This is a broadband bill that Nolan has been spending a lot of pre-session time with and a lot of session time with.
Yeah, so House Bill 3201, as he mentioned, we've talked about a lot. The big broadband bill. The good news is we were finally able to come to an agreement with opponents of the bill, negotiated by Senator Woods and Representative Marsh, that we're able to bring folks together on this. And largely what came out of the amendment is almost everything that we've been asking for. It was done a little bit differently. There are going to be definitions for unserved and underserved for ARPA and BEAD funding. But those definitions are directly tied to each program, and they also provide the flexibility to change those definitions if any federal guidance changes. So the amendment was officially adopted by the committee, and it passed out of the Veterans Committee and is now unfortunately waiting in the long queue for the Senate floor. But the good thing here is it's passed the House, so once it does pass the Senate, it just has to go to the House for a quick concurrence, which we know Representative Marsh is going to accept. And the concurrence usually just jumps to the front of the line of the agenda on that day. So, it's a big win to get this out. We shouldn't have any big hurdles in front of us anymore because the opponents are now behind us on the bill, and hopefully get out of the Senate, get it past the House, and we get the governor to sign it quickly and can start getting that funding to come to Oregon. So that's also why I really wanted to mention that broadband piece earlier. Make sure to look that up, find a community listening session, and make sure to get your input. Hopefully we'll have a lot of funding coming our way soon.
Thanks again. Appreciate the Nolan. Final piece here in terms of some success, kind of a micro hydroelectric outcome. So House Bill 3097. Go ahead, Michael.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Jim. So on Monday, Governor Kotek signed into law a bill that would streamline administrative processes for in-conduit hydroelectric. These passed, House Bill 3097 passed unanimously out of the House and the Senate. And effectively what this would do is any city interested in pursuing in-conduit hydro previously would have been burdened by the underlying water right holder would actually have to do all the application process for this with the Water Resources Department. This bill streamlines that and effectively says all you need is permission from the water right holder to pursue in conduit hydroelectric. So that's it.
Great. Thank you very much. So that concludes overall presentations from us. We've got 11 minutes here before we check out for the end of the day. So we're going to get to questions. And so you can feel free to put them into chat or raise your hand, and we will do our best to work through all the questions from our members. So I'm going to take the first hand that's up right now, and that would be Peter Holland-Haynes. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, I wanted to see as far as the enterprise zones, has there been any discussion about having gradual increases, say at 5 years, that's when it kicks in, where you're gonna have to start paying property taxes, but you can have a gradual increase up to the 10-year point?
Good question. Lindsay, if you're available.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think a like gradual scale has been proposed. I think part of the struggle I've heard is finding a way that is easiest for the county assessors to administer. They have raised some administration issues with excluding the school district portion of taxes. They have said that there are a few other instances where they split like that. But that's a good question. It hasn't been proposed yet, but I think it's certainly something that we could look into. I think, our main focus is trying to find compromises that maintain the value of the incentive for the cities.
Great. Thanks very much, Lindsay. Paul Schaefer, go ahead.
Thank you. Paul Schaefer, Corvallis City Council. And this question was for, I believe it was Scott, regarding funding for the police academy. It is a big problem in our community. We are trying to add police, and the training has slowed us down a lot. And I got distracted at the start of his conversation about that. Is there a specific bill that's attached to, or is it just discussion related to funding in one or more committees so that we can direct our comments effectively? Thank you.
So there's not a bill number right now. I suspect that this would go into this would actually be folded into what we call the Christmas tree bill at the end of session, where they resolve policy and funding issues. But I do anticipate sending an alert out probably later next week with some direction and talking points. We're still DPSST is in correspondence with the agency right now, so I don't want to get ahead of them on our alert, but we'll advise quickly. But I think it's going to happen. I just want to do it when we actually have the firm proposal from the agency.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Scott. So I've got a question that's in chat right now, and this is actually will go to Lindsay as well, because I think it came up during the conversation over incentives. So we'll comment in here from Bill Groff in Aurora. An important question of property tax abatement is whether it covers GO bonds and local levies. That's important to local school districts. So anything that you can share on that, Lindsay?
Yeah, thank you. I had this raised recently, I think, county when they were determining, or when they were examining a potential enterprise zone agreement, had thought about requiring that the company pay into school bonds. So it has briefly been on my radar. To my knowledge, actually, I would need to check. I don't think the companies are required to, but I think, theoretically you could abate property tax, including the portion that goes to school districts, but require that the companies pay levies and bonds, which are issued on top of a regular property tax rate that gets distributed to the local taxing districts. So that's a good point, Teresa. I can look into that more and get back to you.
Thank you for that. I think that's actually one of the pieces that people, there's a substantial gap in not understanding how some of these incentive packages go, is that they look straight at the abatement, that actual number, and they don't realize the amount of negotiation process that takes place on the front end of this, securing additional funds to pay for anything from infrastructure to helping fund some other type of, I'll say, project and stuff in that community. And that's both for the SIP program and also for these enterprise zones. And that's, again, a good message point, I think, for cities and stuff who are on this call who have got those programs, to make sure that you have to communicate. So any other questions? I'm looking for some more hands. I am not seeing anything. And I have nothing else in chat at this point in time. I'll give folks another moment here or two. Okay. So I think we'll go ahead and end it a couple of minutes early. So again, appreciate everybody joining us Friday afternoon for this weekly call. We've got, I'll say, at least 3-4 more weeks of this if we end up finishing June 15th as the targeted signing day. We'll know certainly more what this looks like as we get into Monday. Fingers crossed that the leadership group from the Senate can reach an agreement and we can proceed, because there's an awful lot of important bills coming forward. So stay tuned to the bulletin. Next week, when we have our weekly call, we'll be going back to the noon hour and start it up at 12 o'clock. And as we've said kind of throughout this process and throughout our communication today, that bulletin is really the communication link for all of the hot legislative items. You'll get alerts here as a result of what we're working on, and we appreciate everybody being able to respond. It makes our job easier and helps balance out the advocacy that's going forward from other organizations that don't share our interests, and it's going to be incredibly helpful as we go forward for the rest of the session. So appreciate, again, joining us. Enjoy the rest of your Friday afternoon. Have a good weekend. And I guess this will be the first weekend we hit with some consecutive 90-degree days plus. So stay cool out there and enjoy the sun.